Many apostles in Berserk are born with a purpose, but it isn't as concrete as a mission statement. Do what thou wilt. That is the maxim with which they come into the world, and it's one that they execute in many different ways. But ultimately, apostles exist as inconsequential servants to the God Hand, whose actions feed the cycle of evil. However, there is one apostle in the entire series whose purpose in life wasn't just killing and consuming for the sake of it. He was destined to change the world. The Egg of the Perfect World is one of the creepiest and most unique apostles in all of Berserk. In this video, we're going to take a look at how his anatomy ended up shaping everything that happens in the series' Conviction arc onwards. So, without further ado, let's dive straight into it. Who is the Egg of the Perfect World? Why did he want to become an apostle? Most apostles in Berserk were somebody before they became demons. Rosine was a child with a troubled past who became an apostle because she couldn't stand her abusive family life anymore. The Count was a ruler who didn't have the capacity to process the fact that his own wife could commit heresy, so he sacrificed her because he couldn't face his own pain. We could spend all day guessing who Wild was in his previous life, besides being a geezer of course, but we all know why he wanted to become an apostle: to enjoy and excite. The higher level apostles like Zod, Locus, Grunbeld, Irvine, and Rakshas have clear reasons for being apostles, and some of them have legendary backstories like Locus and Grunbeld. But what happens when you are truly nobody? When there is no one in the world who knows you? No one in the world you know? When you are such an unknown that you don't even have a name, and you've been left to die at the bottom of a trash heap, but, like the cockroaches that scuttle about in your environment, you keep on surviving. Berserk is a story that is predicated on the extremely strong emotions of a human being and how decisions with those emotions end up having massive consequences. The greatest example of this is Griffiths' decision to sleep with Charlotte, because he could have avoided a year's worth of torture if he wasn't so forlorn over losing Guts. Guts himself has made some of his biggest mistakes when he let his emotions get the best of him, like the time he nearly assaulted Casca thinking she was back to normal, driving her further away from herself, or when he declared a unilateral war on all of demonkind, not stopping to consider that he would be leaving a helpless Casca behind. But most characters in Berserk have names. They have relationships with people that lead to these consequences. They have experienced a wide range of emotions, no matter how suppressive or expressive their personalities may be. The man who became the Egg of the Perfect World has only ever known two emotions: rejection and fear. And such a human being is practically earmarked to become an apostle. Before becoming the Egg of the Perfect World, this apostle was nobody, and as nobody, his first memory was of hunting for scraps with the maggots and rats that were his kin. His real family clearly didn't want him. They had dumped him in a trash heap outside a monastic building. His mother was likely a holy woman who accidentally got pregnant and couldn't afford the stain of bringing a child into the world. So she threw him where everything that doesn't belong ends up, in the trash. Nobody grew up a stunted, disfigured humpback of a child. Miura drew his human form to resemble a goblin's. Think Igor from the 1974 film Young Frankenstein, hunched shoulders and all. This was likely a result of nobody often spending days sitting in the fetal position, because that's the default position a child ends up taking subconsciously when they're feeling scared. And his whole life, nobody had been scared. He had no idea who he was. He lived in a trash heap with rodents and insects. He didn't know his name. He barely knew that he was a human being, and his only possession was a funny rock with a face carved into it. He thought of himself as a creature more than a person, but ultimately, he was a human being. One day, nobody gathered the courage to actually try to communicate with the people that kept coming and going from the tower that was his life's backdrop. It's just human nature to want to try communicating with other people. Heck, even animals can suffer from social isolation. But nobody wasn't seen as a person by the good folk that visited the Tower of Conviction. They saw him as a monster, reinforcing his belief that he was more creature than person. When they spotted him spying on them, they pelted him with rocks that sent him back to where he came from, the bottom of the trash heap. This person, who had never experienced an iota of human emotion, learned upon his first interaction with humans that he wasn't one of them. This drove him further into isolation, to the point that he rejected the world and created his own. Nobody would hunt for garbage with his kin in the morning before that incident, but afterwards, he dug himself a cave of sorts at the base of the trash heap, and that's where he stayed when the sun was up. All day long, he'd sit as still as a corpse, and come night, he would begin his forage. As the days passed, nobody's cave turned into a hole, and with time, he dug himself so deep into the earth that the world forgot about him entirely. Then, one day, his home was turned into a grave hole by the people that had swarmed the lands above it, and nobody came knocking at death's door. When he saw the first corpse, he was filled with fear, Because he had never learned how to speak, staying silent came natural to him, and cupping his mouth so as not to emit a sound was something he was very familiar with. But then another body fell in, and another, until nobody was crushed underneath all of the corpses. He was dying underneath dead bodies, filled with intense emotions that he didn't understand. So he let out a cry that was somewhere between a baby's first and a dying man's last. As his breath left him, his call was answered by the God Hand. Because nobody had never learned anything beyond primal survival, his mind was open to concepts like words, forms, and purpose. He understood that the intense things that made him cower night in and night out were fear, sadness, and anger. These emotions were rooted within him because of his lack of identity, and the treatment he received from life made him realize that he hated the world. No one helped him get out of his misery. No one even tried. Nobody grew up in the shadow of the Tower of Conviction run by the Holy See, a place of worship and charity, and he still went uncared for. He felt as though the entire world, which was restricted to the Tower of Conviction for him, was filled with imperfections. So he wanted to create the perfect world and exchanged his life for that purpose. When he was reborn, he was given a form appropriate for carrying out his heart's desire and powers that most apostles would kill to have. But he also received something apostles usually don't get. Why does the egg of the perfect world have a brand of sacrifice on its tongue? The God Hand likes to make the process of becoming an apostle seem simpler than it truly is. In their dance routine, what they ask the participant to do is to sacrifice someone close to them in exchange for the power they need to overcome their past. But the truth is, it's a bit more complicated than that, and in the case of Mr. Nobody, he was missing a key ingredient. We'll get to that in a moment, but first, let us briefly touch upon the mechanism through which an apostle is created. 3 things are necessary for making a demonic reincarnate: a Behelit, a person willing to use it, and a sacrifice. The Behelit is needed because it's the initiation point of all of it. The Behelit is a key to the astral world that links the soul of whoever uses it straight to the abyss. When it's used, it summons the agents of the idea of evil, the God Hand, so they can swell up the ranks of their demonic army. Now, a Behelit is sent forth from the astral world with a person already in mind. However, it cannot do whatever we just described unless the person it is meant for craves the power it offers. When that moment arrives, which is usually at the lowest point of said person's life, the Behelit is activated because of their despair, desire, and blood, bringing them to an interstice. But getting inside of the interstice is just the beginning. What really seals the deal is the sacrifice, and this is what the egg of the perfect world was short on during its own reincarnation process. Most apostles had someone to sacrifice. Rosine gave up her parents, the Count gave up his wife, Grunbeld sacrificed his childhood friends, the egg had no one. He didn't know a single person on Earth, and so who could he sacrifice but himself? But this is also part of what makes him unique, because he's the only living apostle we saw sporting a brand of sacrifice. Usually, apostles kill and devour those marked with the brand. They don't sport it themselves, although that would be an incredibly disrespectful and pretty sick tattoo for an apostle to get. But the egg of the perfect world has a brand of sacrifice on its tongue because of its very specific desire to hatch the new world. See, the egg didn't sacrifice a person like an apostle usually does. He sacrificed the old, ugly, unjust world in favor of one where salvation could be realized. He didn't care how bloody things got because of it. He'd had his fill of blood. But to leave the world that pushed him to this point untouched felt unfair to him. He wanted a world where even a creature like him would have a place to be, so he wished for himself to be the vessel for that change. That's why he has a brand of sacrifice on his tongue, because when he dies, the world starts to change. Being an apostle with a brand makes the egg a magnet for creepy supernatural activity, because, as we know, the brand attracts all things related to demon kind. The only reason St. Albion didn't drown in a tide of blood before the time of the Incarnation ceremony was because, number 1, the egg had become an apostle very recently, and number 2, the Incarnation ceremony needed far more magnetic force than just one apostle's hidden brand of sacrifice. The egg of the perfect world became an apostle after the God Hand gained their 5th member, which means at best he could have been active for 2 years before the Incarnation ceremony. Considering the fact that he was pretty much a child given an adult's knowledge of the world upon reincarnation, he needed some time to figure his shtick out, whilst also working towards his overall purpose. But given that that purpose was predetermined centuries ago, he pretty much didn't have a choice but to wait until the branded pair showed up to St. Albion. The egg of the perfect world is connected to fulfilling not just one but 2 prophecies. The first is the prophecy of the burning pillar. At the beginning of the Conviction arc, Guts was warned that he needed to reach St. Albion to save Casca from a terrifying fate. All he knew was that he was going on a rescue mission, but in truth, his arrival on that holy ground was also a trigger condition for the Incarnation ceremony. Casca reached St. Albion a few weeks before Guts, and her presence alone sent the region into frenzy. She couldn't go out at night without her demon child needing to act as her escort, because she'd stir up the hundreds of deceased souls that lie in the ground surrounding the Tower of Conviction. When the Black Swordsman got there, the blood flow of the dead was triggered. This was a major requirement for the Incarnation ceremony because the blood flow is what ends up absorbing the nutrients required to create the new world. The warning Guts received was half-baked because the person that gave it to him, his demon child, had only a limited amount of time to interact with him. The entire warning should have been grab Casca and get the hell out of there, because once they reached the city, their participation in the Incarnation ceremony became involuntary yet compulsory. This is the true interpretation of the Pillar of Flame prophecy, but the other prophecy is what explains the interesting form that the Egg of the Perfect World takes. Ever wondered why, out of all the apostles in Berserk, only this one looks like a Behelit? Well, that has to do with the second prophecy the egg helps fulfill, the prophecy of the Falcon.
Why does the Egg of the Perfect World look like a Behelit? The real reason for its existence.
Now, we don't know if you guys noticed this, but the Egg of the Perfect World looks a lot like a Behelit. We know, right? How could you miss it? But the reason for the egg looking like a Behelit isn't just that seeing the design come to life has been a demand for many Berserk fans since Chapter 3 of the Black Swordsman arc, it's also tied into the very purpose of his creation. When the egg expressed his desire to create a perfect world through the vessel that was his body, he inadvertently agreed to become a live Behelit. This is because his birth is tied into the machinations of the Incarnation ceremony and the larger picture that is the prophecy of the Falcon. Longtime viewers of the channel will know what the prophecy is all about, but we'll still go over it because it explains the Incarnation ceremony as well. Threads upon threads upon threads, huh? The prophecy states that when the sun dies 5 times, a red lake will appear west of the land with a name both old and new. It is a sign that the 5th angel will alight. He is the Falcon of Darkness, the king of the blind white sheep, and the master of the sinful black sheep. He is the bringer of the age of darkness. We've paraphrased it here, but when we read this prophecy for the first time, we thought it referred to Griffiths' rebirth as a god hand. Then we googled what alight meant, and we realized that this was something else entirely. That word roughly translates to descending from the heavens, and that is where the Incarnation ceremony and the Egg of the Perfect World become relevant. In Chapter 142, on his way to St. Albion to rescue Casca, Guts meets a guy that he doesn't particularly like, but finds himself owing a lot of favors to, Skull Knight. During their brief conversation, the Wandering Wraith explains the nature of the Incarnation ceremony, which allows us to decipher its practical operation. He says that once in about 1,000 years, mankind reaches a critical mass of negative thoughts and emotions, which concentrates at one point, allowing someone in the divine domain to incarnate into the physical world. He says that this ceremony is an imitation of the eclipse, and in the case of the one that was about to occur in Guts' timeline, it represented the descent of someone that represents the Falcon. Skull Knight finishes the explanation by commenting on how changing the Incarnation ceremony was futile because it was like the moon's shadow being reflected on water, and said moon existed outside the reach of man. What he meant to say was the Incarnation ceremony is a physical reflection of events that take place in the astral world. Now, we've already told you guys the astral requirements for this ceremony, the brand of sacrifice on both Guts and Casca's bodies. But how does the manifestation of ethereal spirits change the physical world? Well, that's where the egg and its shape come into play. The Egg of the Perfect World is basically a substitute for a Behelit in this pseudo-eclipse. A proper Behelit acts as a conduit between the two worlds by linking the heart and soul of the person who uses it to the abyss. Behelits usually pull humans into an interstice, but the egg is designed to work the other way round. Its sole function is to give physical form to something that can only exist in the astral world, and it does so by bringing them into the physical world. In essence, the Egg of the Perfect World is a Behelit reverse engineered, but like a Behelit, it has certain conditions that need meeting if it's to fulfill its purpose, namely sacrifices. Behelits only work properly if the person using them ends up making a sacrifice with their power. Otherwise, it's pretty much useless, because the sacrifice is the medium through which a human becomes an apostle. It is the wax that seals their transition from human to inhuman, because if you're willing to kill your loved ones just to escape your own emotions and get some power, then you deserve to go to hell later. But keeping all of that aside, Behelits only require 1 or 2 sacrifices, maybe 3 depending on the fates that they have in store for you. It is the Crimson Behelit that demands more blood, considering it also creates God Hand members. When you use the Crimson Behelit, you don't just become linked to the Abyss, you become an entirely astral entity. The nature of your very existence changes, so the demands are far greater. In the case of Griffith, 500 good men died to create a despicable deity. But bringing a God Hand from the metaphysical to the physical is an extraordinary task that demands hundreds of sacrifices, and a vessel that can channel their power into creating a physical body. And this is why the egg of the perfect world looks like a Behelit. He plays the role of the Behelit in every sense. He's the vessel which will cradle the sacrifices of the thousands gathered in and around St. Albion, nurture it within himself, and then exchange his life for the life within, bringing Griffith back to the world. And none of what we just said is meant to be a metaphor, that's literally how it ends up working out. The Incarnation ceremony is an imitation of the eclipse in an almost literal fashion. Brand of sacrifice is present thanks to Guts, Casca, and the egg himself. The sacrifices are the people present in St. Albion on that infernal day. The enabling apostles of the ceremony are the Great Goat and Father Mozgus with disciples, and the reincarnation cocoon's role, with which Griffith turned into Femto, is filled in by the egg of the perfect world as well. During the eclipse, when Griffith accepted the God Hand's deal, his body was encased within a fleshy cocoon atop the altar, into which the blood of his sacrificed comrades rushed, gathered from all over the interstice. Griffith felt their souls pierce through his own, but expressed no remorse and was reborn shortly after, bathed in their blood. That blood and their souls changed his nature, made it incorporeal more than human. This exact sequence of events needed to play out in the physical world, minus the fact that the sacrifices needed to be his comrades for him to be incarnated. And the egg's destiny, the reason he became an apostle, was to hatch Griffith, as weird as that sounds. So that's the egg of the perfect world's reason for looking like a Behelit explained. But that wasn't his only displayed power in the series. The egg is an apostle after all, and like all apostles, he too has unique abilities.
What are the egg of the perfect world's powers? Why it's more dangerous than you think.
The danger of the egg doesn't lie in its strength or monstrosity like it does with most apostles. For starters, the egg isn't massive. It's about 2 to 3 feet in height, which is unusually small for an apostle, and he doesn't have a combat mode. An egg-shaped upper body with distorted facial features, 2 squat legs, and 2 tentacles. Those are all the weapons the egg of the perfect world possessed. If he were to enter a one-on-one fight whose outcome would be determined purely based on strength, he'd emerge the loser always. The egg was birthed for a very specific purpose, and while that purpose itself involves great power, it isn't relevant to the egg's strength. But just because he isn't conventionally strong like an apostle, doesn't mean that the egg of the perfect world isn't dangerous. In the wild, animals that lack in one department make up for it in another. Those who have the strength to defend themselves don't need camouflage to protect themselves. Those who show their bright colors boldly aren't inviting you to admire them, and where power doesn't prevail, speed does. Just ask a kite. The egg of the perfect world might not be a Zod or a Grunbeld in terms of strength, but he's on par with them in one thing, if not surpassing them entirely, and that thing is speed. The reason the egg doesn't have physical strength is because its body is created for a specific purpose, but it needs to survive at the same time, so it relies on its other traits to get to the promised time, starting off with speed. The egg of the perfect world is blindingly fast. Its legs might be small, but they're all muscle, and his tentacles only add to his mobility. The egg can maneuver these limbs so quickly you won't even have time to blink before they get you, and he's managed to outpace one of the fastest characters in the series, Skull Knight. When Skull Knight and the egg came face to face, the foe of the Inhumans tried to strike down the Inhuman in front of him post-haste. Skull Knight had some idea about what was about to happen, and he knew that this apostle was connected to it. Now, SK's speed was demonstrated during the eclipse, when he broke into the interstice, avoided Griffith's spatial warping, killed dozens of apostles, and broke out of the place all in the same breath, but not before saving Guts and Casca. This guy fights to kill, especially when it's apostles. His reflexes are literally otherworldly, but because the egg of the perfect world is so fast, he wasn't able to one-shot the guy. He catches him on the stomach, but Skull Knight is unaware of this, and the fact that he didn't notice is all the proof you need about the egg's superior speed. Apart from that, the egg also has the power to turn humans into pseudo-apostles, and unlike other pseudo-creators, he can allow them to pick their forms. The Great Goat looked completely different from Father Mozgus and his angels in his released form. He also didn't have as many powers as Mozgus and his disciples did, but that comes down to the goat's lack of an imagination. Usually, pseudo-apostles reflect the image of their creators, but neither the Great Goat nor Father Mozgus look like Behelits, now do they? This is because the egg pseudos take forms that reflect their ideal images in their own heads, just like regular apostles. Well, the egg created these two sets to speed up the incarnation ceremony. He could technically create pseudos whenever he wanted, and considering the difficulty Guts had dealing with Father Mozgus in particular, we're glad we never met a pseudo of the eggs that had a stronger grasp on magic and a looser one on sanity. If the egg wasn't meant to die in the incarnation ceremony, it could have technically lived up to however much it wanted. Now, imagine an immortal, extremely agile apostle with an endless pseudo army where each of them has their own unique powers that far outweigh that of any other of their kind. Would have wiped out the need for a reborn band of the Falcon, but the creation of that force is kind of the reason the egg of the perfect world even existed. Like we've mentioned throughout this video, the egg's existence is entirely related to fulfilling prophecy and terrible purpose. Still, the fact that it managed to coordinate and oversee that many things in such little time and with such effectiveness is proof that he is one of Berserk's most dangerous apostles. The egg is directly responsible for changing the course of the world itself, and were its life not tied to its sacrifice, it would have been enough to bridge the gap between the old and new worlds. But speaking of that, there is one little mistake that said bridge ended up making in its pursuit for perfection, and that might be the undoing of Humpty Dumpty's perfect world.
Did the egg of the perfect world mess up Griffiths' incarnation? How it might have saved the world?
Now, when the egg was created, the plan was simple. It would manipulate events and people up until the promised time. When that time came, it would oversee the blood flow of the dead and then lodge itself at the top of the Tower of Conviction, where it would bloom and hatch Griffith. A wrinkle appeared in this plan when the egg decided to do something no other apostle had done up until that point in the series: show compassion. You see, for all its speed, the nick on its stomach gifted to him by the Skull Knight was killing the egg. That didn't matter in the grand scheme of things because he was meant to die anyways, but in the present, it influenced his subconscious to think of the big what-ifs of his life. In his final moments, which were far longer than a human's, mind you, the egg reflected. He kidnapped Luca so he could pour out his life story to her and confirm his own existence through it. He saw Father Mozgus and thought to himself that maybe he could have become one of the Bloody Inquisitor's disciples had he been found by the man, musing about a life of acceptance. And then he arrives at the dying body of the demon child and decides that they would share their suffering by becoming one. The egg was consciously rejecting its emotions in favor of seeing his perfect world born, but when he saw the demon child, his human kindness kicked in. Though he was a monster, he swallowed the child into his own body for safekeeping so it could enter the new world with him. The egg showed compassion in a moment of humanity, and it's poetic irony that can prove to be the undoing of his own dream. When the egg receives the blood flow of the dead, instead of generating Griffith's vessel from scratch, he ends up transmuting the demon child into a combination of itself and Femto. This doesn't bother the God Hand too much because for the most part, he's the one in control of his body. But on nights of the full moon, the Moonlight Boy takes over, and while everyone knows Griffith cannot be killed, no one is quite sure about the Moonlight Boy. His body should be mortal because he was a human fetus infected with evil. His being is part organic and therefore part mortal. Had plans gone the way they were intended to from the beginning, Griffith's body of flesh would have been no more than a vessel to contain his power. But with the surfacing of the demon child's mortal soul from within it on nights of the full moon, it leaves him open to a killing, and it's insane to think that the very man who wanted all this to work out was the one who also created a way to demolition it all. The egg's death was the day that the perfect world was conceived. Magical borders between the physical and astral worlds started loosening up following Griffith's incarnation, and when he caused the Great Roar, he made the egg's dream a reality. But in the process, his own dream has been put at stake, and it's just elite storytelling that it all stems from what he intended to give up when he himself became a demon, a person's humanity.
Marvelous verdict!
Let us know what you thought of the Egg of the Perfect World in the comment section down below. He's not the coolest apostle, he's not the strongest or the smartest or the most interesting, but he is maybe the roundest. Let us know what you think. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more marvelous anime content, and we'll see you guys in the next video. But until then, keep on struggling, strugglers.